Okay, welcome students. In this video we're going to go over the process of graphing linear equations. In problem number 2, it says that we're supposed to use the equation that's given to write a table of 3 values, identify the slope, the y-intercept, and then also graph the line. Now if you look at the equation that we have, it's in slope-intercept form. And I think the first thing we want to do is identify the slope, try to find out our y-intercept, and maybe just start from there. So if we look at the equation, it's in slope-intercept form. So that fraction in front of that x is the slope, and that constant value, that number -4, or subtract 4, if you want to look at it that way, is the y-intercept. So right off the bat, we can find our slope, which is a -1/3, and our y-intercept, which is 0 and a -4. Let's go ahead and plot our y-intercept. Now remember, the y-intercept is the point on our y-axis. Wherever our line is, it has to intersect that point. So that's why that's so important. So that y-intercept gives us 1 point on the line. Now we're going to use our slope and that y-intercept to fill in the rest of our table. So we're going to start counting the slope from the y-intercept. Now according to the slope, it says that we go down 1 in the y direction, and then we go over 1, 2, 3, +3 in the x direction, and from the y-intercept it's going to get us another lattice point that's on the graph. We're going to go ahead and graph that now. Now see how I count it? I go down the 1 and then to the right 3. That gives me a lattice point right there, and it looks like it's at a -3 and 5. And then I'll do the other lattice point, down 1 and to the right 3, and it looks like that ordered pair is going to be 6 and a -6. So let's mark that lattice point. Now we're going to go ahead and I think we're going to write those values in our table. Let me get my pen set. So there's our line. You can see where it is, and we can see that point, like I said, is 3 and a -5. Goes 3 to the right, down 5, and then over here is 6 and -6. Now it doesn't matter which order you write those in the table, just make sure you write them. It's best to start from the farthest to the left and go to the right, and that makes it a little bit easier sometimes. But as long as we have those values in the table, it really doesn't matter the order. Okay, so now we've got our table complete. You can see our line has to be right. What we've got there for our points, it makes a straight line, and these are linear equations, so that means that our graph checks out and our data checks out. Okay, this next way, I'm going to do it a little bit different. I'm going to use a calculator to generate our points rather than using the slope and the y-intercept to generate our points. It will still give me the same result, but this way it's best that you use a calculator. So now when you're choosing your points, if you look at your denominator of 3, we want to choose our first value always to be 0. The next 2 points have to be based upon the denominator. I'll choose a positive denominator, then I'll choose a negative denominator, and I'm going to put those values into my calculator. Now I'm writing down exactly how those values should look in your calculator. You've got a -1 divided by 3 for your slope. You're putting the x value in parentheses, so that first x is 0. Now you can see that I'm putting a 3 into that value, and then the last one, the -1 divided by 3, I'll put a -3 in for the x, and then I'll type these 3 expressions into my calculator and see what values I get out, and those values will be the y coordinate of the ordered pair. So here, let's just get my calculator and type it in. Subtract 4, and let me hit enter here. So that first value matches with what I should have for the y-intercept. You can see that. So that's a good way to make sure that I'm on the right track, that I'm using my calculator right. It gets that y-intercept correct. Now the only thing that I need to do next is to change that 0 to a +3. That's the next value in my table. it gives me a -5, and I think that was the value that we had before, 3, -5. And then this value is going to be different because I'm using a -3 instead of that +6. So -1/3. I'm going to put a -3 -4, and it gives me a different y-intercept, which is a -3. Now let's graph these ordered pair. Okay, so there's the points that we started with. Now let's graph the 3, -5. We already had that point, and now we've got to add that -3, -3, and it's right there. Now if I bring up my line, you can see that's the graph that I had before. I haven't moved my straight edge at all, and you can see that it lines up. So that means that this graph checks out because it gives me collinear, gives me a linear equation. Okay, in this next problem, we're actually given the table, and we have to find the slope, we have to find the y-intercept, and then from that two pieces of information, we're supposed to write the equation. And I think the best way to do this is we're going to go ahead and graph our ordered pair, our table of ordered pair. You can see the first thing that we're given is the y-intercept. So why don't we go ahead and fill that in. Now I know it's the y-intercept because it starts, the leading x value is 0. So whatever that number that follows in the y position is the y-intercept. So that's 0 and 5. Now remember, the y-intercept is where our line is supposed to intersect the y-axis. So we're going to just go ahead and start graphing our points in this table and see where it takes us on our graph. So the next ordered pair is a +3 and up 7. Now the 7's off the graph, but that's okay. We're just going to estimate where that 7 is. And our next ordered pair is a -3 and 3. Now be sure that you graph your equations correctly. Now, one thing that we learned from the last problem is I can't use the calculator on this because I don't have an equation. I have to generate the equation. So the idea is I'm going to use those lattice points to count the slope. So now if you see the slope there, I go from one point to the next, I go up 2. So that means the change in the y's would be a +2. And the change in the x's would be a +3. And you can see that's exactly what it shows in the table compared to the graph. So that means my slope is a +2/3. Now with knowing the slope and the y-intercept, I can use the slope-intercept form of a line to write my graph. So there's I matches the data. The data is a straight line, so I know that I've graphed my data correctly, so that means my slope has to be correct. So now y equals mx plus b is a slope-intercept form. Remember, the m is the slope, and that letter b represents the y-intercept of 0 and 5. And remember, the only part that I need of that ordered pair is the y piece, which would be 5. So now I can write my equation. Y equals m is 2/3. And looks like x, and then I have to add the 5. So that's it. You can see the y-intercept matches. See 5 on the table, 5 in the on the graph, and 5 in the equation, and so forth. And you can see I can actually pick up another lattice point right there. So you know that this has to be right. Okay. Okay, in the next problem, we have to find 3 lattice points. They actually give us the line for the equation. We have to create a table from those 3 lattice points, and then we need to find the slope and the y-intercept. And then finally, last of all, once we know the slope and the y-intercept, we're going to write our equation. Okay, so the first thing let's find our lattice points. The easiest one to find is the y-intercept. You can see that's where the line intersects the y-axis, and looks like it's at 0 and 2. So right off the bat, I feel that first value in my table, and then I know that's the y-intercept because that's a 0 for the x, and that number, which will be the y-intercept for the y point. Now we're going to wait on making the table. Let's see if we can find some more lattice points, and once we get some more lattice points we should be able to count our slope. So I'm looking for lattice points. There's one right there, so we have one on the top right hand corner and then over there towards the middle right. So now we want to take those lattice points, we want to count our slope. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in for this and do this in blue. Now it doesn't matter which lattice point you use. I'm going to start over farthest to the left. You can see I'm counting down. It looks like I'm counting down 3 units. And then if I count to the right, see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units to the right, it gets to my next lattice point. So that tells me my slope is a -3/5. Remember, the change in the y's go on top, the change in the x's go on the bottom. So that is my slope. So now I'm going to write it for my slope. Change in y's over the change in the x's is -3/5. So that quick, I have the values to finish my equation. So remember the slope. This is the second thing I want to find. I found the y-intercept. Be the third thing I'm going to write in there. And so we're almost done. Now we just have to write our equation. So y equals m x plus b. Remember, m is the 3/5. Change in y over the change of the x's, and the y-intercept is 2. So that matches what we have there. Now let's pick off our ordered pair from the table. Let's put it in the table from the graph. I can see the far right side is 5, -1, and the far point on the left-hand side is at a -5 and 5. So that finishes that problem, and we're all done. Okay, these last two problems, I've already got the work done for it because there's really no math to do. When you have an equation that only has one variable in it, what you've got to understand is that equation can only go through the axis that has a variable for. So this one can only go through the y-axis. So that means it has to be a flat line, a horizontal line. If it's a slanted line, it has to go through both axes, and it can. And as far as the slope, we haven't really talked about what type of slope is this. And as far as using the table, that table is kind of useless on these type of lines. Now if you look at number 8, it has an x equals a -2, so it only can go through the x-axis because it only has an x variable with it. So it has to go vertically. It's a vertical line and it passes through the x-axis. And again, you can't use the table to help you write this, and the slope on this, we haven't talked about it, so don't worry about the slope. So that's the end of this video, and thanks a lot for watching, and have a good afternoon.